Hello and welcome to our panel discussion. We're discussing the UN, Canada, and Israel. There's an odd relationship between all three, and this is something that we're going to be addressing today. My guests, George Woodward, Bob Mayton, and Bill Smythe. Now, the first item on the agenda in the news recently, Stanley Michael Link, a professor of Western University in London, he was appointed as Special Rapporteur on Palestinian territories in the United Nations. Now that was a blow up in Canada because he's got a long history of blatant anti-Semitism where he has openly been a guest in speeches such as those which represent one-state solutions. I mean, this guy's got it. We're going to discuss more about what he has in his history. But that's one thing. Another one is Canadian Foreign Affairs Minister Stéphane Dion announced $15 million to go to the UN. And when questioned, why would we do business with an organization that has become so viciously against Israel? And if you look at the members of the United Nations Security Council, Human Rights Council, it is a disgrace. You've got some of the world's worst violators on there. So the answer was, well, maybe Canada can have some positive influence on the United Nations. Thoughts?
Well, I think the Liberal Party in power right now has a real problem. On the one hand, I like the fact that they have dissociated themselves from Michael Link. Stéphane Dion has said that he was not their appointment. They would have made another appointment if they had the choice, and they are not going along with this appointment. Michael Link is anti-Semitic, there's no question. And I think that the Liberal Party is skating through a minefield because on the one hand, they want to ingratiate themselves with the UN because they want a seat on the Security Council and possibly get onto the Human Rights Commission as well, where Michael Link is the rapporteur to Palestine. So whether the Liberals, their intention, they say, is to influence the Human Rights Commission and the UN in the direction of Israel, but whether it works the other way is really an interesting question. What happened with the Conservatives in the past, when the Conservatives tried this tactic a few years ago, is that the UN sent people to investigate Canada's human rights record. And they found that there was lots of discrimination going on against women and against Native people, and that the rates of jail, for example, for various groups varied, and made a terrible report to the UN about Canada's human rights record. And so the Conservatives basically withdrew from it. I think the Liberals are going to run into the same problem.
Now, there's a lot of pressure that came from the Jewish groups as well against this Link's appointment, calling on the Liberal government to condemn the appointment, which they did. But also, Simon Wiesenthal also called on the federal government to withdraw its $15 million in funding, which it has not done.
I mean, to me, Michael Link is a perfect candidate for the UN Human Rights Commission. I mean, the record, they were formed 10 years ago because the previous organization, which was called the UN Council for Human Rights, had so disgraced itself that the name could no longer be used. And some current members on the current council are Iran, Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, China, who swallowed Tibet 30 or 40 years ago, Cuba, we know about, Iraq, where the Yazidis are persecuted, Russia, Turkey. Gaddafi's Libya was a prominent member sort of 10 years ago. So it's a perfect organization for somebody who's an anti-Semite to belong to. Under George W. Bush, the United States ignored the council, but now, of course, under President Obama, the U.S. is taking a leading role. For some good information on the Human Rights Council, you should go online to UN Media Watch, or UN Watch, sorry.
I mean, beheadings are still happening in Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
I wonder if in a year from now, whether our Liberal government, behind the scenes, of course, will begin to question why did we ever do that. I think personally this whole funding of the UN as
You're talking the $15 million.
I am, yeah.
Yes.
I think it was a reaction on the Liberal government to say we're back on the world scene and we're going to do a whole bunch of things to convince you that we are, and this is just one of them, without really thinking it through or maybe having the proper understanding of all of the ramifications of that. And I really think that behind the scenes they'll say, boy, that was one we shouldn't have gotten ourselves involved
So we
with.
hope, yes.
So we hope, yes.
So we
indeed.
hope, yeah.
Now, you worked on the UN.
Well, I was with
some
the UN
years.
for 15 years, but not in any political role in terms of providing international aid and management and that sort of thing. But I must say, from what I saw then, the current state of the UN human rights industry doesn't surprise me in the least.
Now, I promised to mention some of the other awful statements that Lynx has made in the past. For one thing, he stated at a conference that the solution dates back to 1948 when Israel was founded, and he referred to the beginning of Israel's ethnic cleansing. I mean, how on earth did he arrive at that? I'd like to know. He also reportedly blamed 9/11, the attacks on Western nations. So this is a kind of a guy that we're dealing with here, and it's one thing to condemn him, but it's another thing to start even paying into. You see, we can't blame the federal government for that appointment because there's no relationship between his appointment and the federal government, we know that. But at the same time, do we need to be really pouring money into the United Nations, particularly with what they're doing? And I think this is something that we need to be dealing with. Another thing about the UN, what about its record when it comes to Israel? What about Durban 1, which is intended to investigate real racism globally? Let's talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. I really like what Mark Stain has to say about some of these issues. One of the things that, one of the terms that he's coined is the term preemptive submission, which I think sums it up very nicely. I think that we are in a process of, because we've denied our own identity as a Western civilization as being valuable in the world, we are now adopting the values of other, with a multicultural approach. We're adopting the values and the approaches to life of people that really are very problematic, who hate Jews, and Michael Link is associating himself with them, and I believe that this is a terrible appointment. And I don't know how Canada is going to escape from this dilemma that it's in at this point.
I mean, racism does matter. We look at it internationally, and this is something that often does not get discussed in our culture, that black slaves are still being held by Muslims in Mauritania. The racism, look what happened in Darfur, where 400,000 black Christians were murdered and close to 2 million displaced. These are the things that are going on, and one group against the other, and it's not just with one race, it's global. Racism is a global issue, yet with Durban, that was supposed to investigate racism globally, it ended up being an Israel hate fest. And I think when you look at the kinds of people on the Human Rights Council, the UN Human Rights Council, and the history of the United Nations in Israel, it's something that we need. I don't know why we accept these things as nations, as Western nations. That baffles me. Any final words on before we close?
There has to be much more at play behind the scenes than what is visible as we look at it in just the events of today. And so you're absolutely right. To think we can actually make sense of why we do the things we do and put up with what we do, there has to be much more going on that we're not aware of. So.
Yes. Any other closing remarks?
Yeah, I think that's the way that the UN has gone in the past, if it continues in that direction, I think that I find that very problematic. I think that the UN is anti-Semitic. Every day you see resolutions condemning Israel when there are all kinds of human rights violations going on all over the world, and yet the focus and the target is always Israel, and I think that's completely wrong, an expression of Jew hatred.
And by pouring another $15 million into the UN, what are we doing? We're just currying favor with a whole bunch of states who are non-democratic, Israel bashers, and so on. And really discredits us in the eyes
It's
of
troubling
right-thinking
because it's an
people.
endorsement of human rights crimes.
Yes.
It's an endorsement.
Please share this video, and on YouTube, click the button below to become a subscriber. In consideration of Canada's 150th birthday, please consider 150 ways to bless Israel through your Christian embassy, the ICEJ Canada. Consider becoming a $150 monthly donor. Plant 150 trees, 150 prayers for Israel. The opportunities are endless. Please contact us.